This story involves a wonderful mother-in-law who drove out her son-in-law's parents when they attempted to settle in her daughter's house under the pretense of needing a place to stay briefly. What could have possibly happened? Let's delve into it together. Please subscribe and like our channel.
Hello, I'm a grandmother who's past 60. Nowadays, it seems a bit embarrassing to call myself a grandmother, but I do have a grandchild, so I guess it fits. I have raised a son and a daughter. My husband and I started with nothing and managed to secure 2 houses. I worked, managed the household, and raised our children until I was almost 60. In my youth, I barely slept and worked hard without even realizing how tough it was. As I approached 60, my husband and children insisted that I should take it easy, so I quit working. My daughter-in-law was the one who most strongly urged me to quit. She said that if I didn't work, I could cook delicious meals, but that wasn't the only reason. She felt I had worked too hard, juggling a job and raising children, and that it was time for me to rest. She says she could never live the way I did. My daughter-in-law treats me very well, even though I wasn't able to do much for her when my son got married. My first child is a daughter, and my second is a son. My son got married before my daughter. My daughter also got married at a fairly late age. I had a lot of worries about my son-in-law's parents after my daughter got married. The stories I heard from my daughter made me wonder if there are still in-laws like that these days. Even in my youth, such in-laws were rare. My daughter's mother-in-law often comes to my daughter's house and stays for several days. Even though it's her son's house, it seemed to me that she doesn't understand it's rude to just come and go as she pleases. Sometimes both her mother-in-law and father-in-law come and stay for several days. My daughter says it's very hard for her. My daughter has 2 sons who go to daycare. Imagine how hard it must be for a daughter-in-law when the in-laws come to stay in such a household. If they came, stayed quietly, and then left, it might be tolerable. But they complain about the side dishes and nag her before leaving. I was angry with the in-laws. But I also didn't think too highly of my son-in-law. How many mothers can stand to see their daughters suffer and not dislike their sons-in-law? My son-in-law is the second son. When the mother-in-law comes to my daughter's house, she badmouths my elder daughter-in-law. She says that when she goes to the elder son's house, it's chaotic, messy, and the elder daughter-in-law has no manners. But I wonder if the mother-in-law herself knows any manners. When grandparents visit their grandchildren's house, they should think about helping with the household chores. But my daughter's mother-in-law had no such thoughts. She yells at the children if they're noisy at home. What do those little ones know? When both my children got married, we gave 50 million won each. My son-in-law's parents originally planned to give more, but when they heard we were giving 50 million won, they decided to give the same amount. If they got married with the same amount of money from both families, shouldn't they refrain from expecting more respect just because they're the in-laws? My daughter's mother-in-law always emphasized that the in-laws come first to my daughter. She heard so much about the importance of treating the in-laws well that it was drilled into her ears. My daughter gives us 100,000 won a month as pocket money, and she gives the same amount to her in-laws. But her mother-in-law once questioned whether it made sense to give the same amount to her in-laws and her own parents. My daughter countered by asking why it wouldn't make sense when she received the same amount from both families when she got married. I wasn't pleased to hear such a story. The mother-in-law should question her own son, not my daughter. And if the mother-in-law says such things, the son-in-law should stand up and persuade his mother before my daughter has to. But there was none of that, which was frustrating. Then last spring, the in-laws said they would live in my daughter's house for a few months. They were moving and the contract dates for their house didn't line up. So they said they would live at their son's house. The elder son has only one child and lives in a larger house. So I couldn't understand why they chose to stay at the younger son's house. My daughter called me to vent. She was having a hard time with her in-laws living in her home. They complained about the side dishes, nitpicked about the housekeeping. Hearing her talk about these things made me very angry. But I couldn't badmouth the in-laws to my daughter. So I just listened to what she had to say. They would throw their socks and underwear anywhere, and it was always my daughter who had to pick them up. It was already uncomfortable having guests in the house. And they were creating more work for her, so it must have been very hard for her. She complained to her husband, but he just apologized and asked her to bear with it for a while. Just a few days before the in-laws were supposed to move out, they told my daughter that they had decided not to leave and would continue living there. They said this out of the blue, without explaining the reason why. They just said that the contract for the house they were supposed to move to had been cancelled. My daughter was at a loss. So she brought her 2 children to our house. She said that she couldn't live with her in-laws even if it meant divorcing. My husband and I were at a loss as to what to do. That evening my son-in-law came to our house and asked my daughter to come home. But she refused to go. I asked my son-in-law why he hadn't stopped his parents from moving in from the beginning. He said that he was regretting it now. I asked him what he would do if my daughter decided not to see her in-laws anymore. He said he would probably have to live without seeing his parents as well. Then I suggested that he should get his parents to move out. But he said he couldn't bring himself to say it. So we offered to go with him and speak on his behalf. He thanked us for the offer, so my husband and I went to my daughter's house. When we got there, we talked to the in-laws together. At first, my daughter's father-in-law said, "What's wrong with a son taking care of his parents?" We asked why they wanted to live in this small house together. We also suggested that if they wanted to rely on a son, they should rely on their eldest son. But they said it was their decision and told us not to interfere. My husband told them, "When the kids got married, we gave as much money as you did, so we have a right to speak." He also said that since we had contributed more to the household and the grandchildren, we had a right to speak louder. But the father-in-law still insisted that the in-laws should come first. At that point, we had nothing more to say. We couldn't leave my daughter to live with such strange people. So we decided to take her home with us. The father-in-law told us not to do anything irresponsible. My husband told him that it was his actions that were leading to a divorce. As we were about to leave, my son-in-law shouted at his parents to leave. He said, "Didn't you give my elder brother 200 million won for his housing deposit when he got married? Then go and rely on him and my sister-in-law. Why are you doing this to me? You're trying to break up our marriage. I want to live with my wife and children. I don't want to be a divorced man who can't see his children because of my parents. I want you to leave right now." Seeing my son-in-law stand up like that made me feel a bit relieved. The in-laws seemed taken aback and didn't know what to do. In the end, they said they would go to their eldest son's house and told us to go home and relax. My husband said he wouldn't be able to relax until he saw them leave. The in-laws packed their things and left. And my son-in-law said he would take them to his brother's house. After seeing my son-in-law return, we were able to return home with peace of mind. My son-in-law apologized to me and my husband, promising that such an incident would never happen again. I felt quite sorry for him, and my husband agreed. But what could we do? The in-laws were the ones at fault for their lack of consideration. And they had to be driven out of my daughter's house. The in-laws were forced to leave their eldest son's house the very next day. It seems their eldest daughter-in-law is quite formidable. The moment the in-laws entered, she threatened divorce. So the in-laws had no choice but to spend a few nights in a motel. Whilst looking for a one-room apartment, I heard they managed to find a house and moved out about a month later. The mother-in-law called my daughter to vent about how ungrateful their kids were. But my daughter firmly responded, "Who would live with a mother-in-law who complains about side dishes and yells at the children for making noise?" One would think that after hearing such words, the in-laws would reflect on themselves a bit. However, they seem to only harbor resentment towards their children and daughters-in-law. Recently, the father-in-law even said to my son-in-law over the phone, "Raising kids is pointless." After hearing this, my son-in-law said he doesn't want to have any more contact with his parents. We were worried that my son-in-law might hold a grudge against us. But my daughter reassured us. He told her that if we hadn't spoken so strongly, he would have had difficulty telling his parents to leave. My husband and I didn't raise our children to be pushovers. We taught them to not neglect their duties, not to harm others, and not to let others trample over them. We were worried that my son-in-law might hold a grudge against us, but my daughter reassured us. He told her that if we hadn't spoken so strongly, he would have had difficulty telling his parents to leave. My husband and I didn't raise our children to be pushovers. We taught them to not neglect their duties, not to harm others, and not to let others trample over them. We were worried that if the in-laws, who call themselves adults, kept demanding special treatment, our daughter would be unhappy for the rest of her life. We even thought that divorce might be better for her. Thankfully, my son-in-law chose to side with my daughter, and the issue seems to have been resolved well. I've seen many bad people in my life, but this is the first time I've seen parents trying to cause their child's divorce. I'm worried about my daughter, but what can I do? She's already married and has 2 children. I just have to trust in my son-in-law, who has proven to be upright.
It seems like the son-in-law is the only sane one in his family. I wonder if his parents are either oblivious to their wrongdoings or they simply don't want to acknowledge them. Even if they don't realize their faults with continued estrangement from their children, hopefully, they will understand that they shouldn't keep acting oddly. It appears that the mother-in-law did the right thing for her grandchildren as well. What do you all think?